Good morning, Cornerstone. So good to see you here at home, making yourselves at home. And I hope all of you at home, well, you're at home, so you're always making yourself at home. But thank you so much for being with us today. So many of you are on, and we are so glad to share this time together. Ann said we had a two-part sermon today. The good news is I'm only doing part one today, and we'll do part two next week. Make yourself at home. Usually, when somebody's coming through the door and they're a good friend, make yourself at home. Have you ever said that? Have you ever said that? Have you ever regretted saying that? Good. If you said no, that is awesome. That is awesome. Make yourself at home. Make yourself at home. It's a little risky, isn't it? It's a little risky. I'm just going to be honest. As I have aged, gotten old, my nickname is the Ogre. I'm one of those becoming, although fighting it every day, one of those get off my lawn type of people. Make yourself at home. God says that to us about himself. Make yourself at home. But just like people who might come through the door and you say, make yourself at home, and you mean it, but if they take that really, really far, they may do some things that you don't do in your home. Or it causes you to do a lot of cleanup. Maybe there's a lot of crumbs on the floor, dishes left out, toilet seat left up. We mess up like that sometimes, don't we? Now, that was not a commentary on our hangouts or our time together, because as we live together, we drop crumbs. We bump each other, our coffee spills. That's no big deal. But the Father says, make yourself at home. And sometimes we leave crumbs and the toilet seat up and take something out of the fridge that was meant for something else or for someone else. We do things like that in our Father's home. And yet he, our God, is not a get off my lawn kind of God. When he says, make yourself at home, he means it. Our text for today is John 15, verses 1 through 8. That's going to be our part one. Our part two follows on after that text in John 15, verses 9 through 17. We'll be talking about that next week. And I'm not going to be going as deep into the theme of make yourself at home. This word that we're going to be looking at, this word abide. I'll hit some highlights, but we'll dive a little bit deeper into that word next week. And today we'll look at another word in John 15. Jesus uses two metaphors in this short text that don't really seem to relate to one another, but they actually have more in common than one might think. Let's go to John 15, 1 through 8, and we'll read it. I am the true vine, and my Father is the gardener. He cuts off every branch in me that bears no fruit, while every branch that does bear fruit, he prunes, so that it will be even more fruitful. You are already clean. Some texts say you are already pruned. It's probably a better word than to use the word clean. You are already pruned because of the word I have spoken to you. Remain in me as I also remain in you. Now, this is the New International Version. And some translations, actually, as I looked up this particular verse in about 60 different translations, it's about half and half. Some use the word remain, and others use the word abide. A-B-I-D-E, abide. Abide. I like that word. It's comforting. It's welcoming. It's inviting. It's like sanctuary. Abide. So I'll use that word as we go through. Abide in me as I also abide in you. It takes on a more of a relational, deep, communal feel to it than simply the word remain. Abide in me as I also abide in you. No branch can bear fruit by itself. It must abide, remain in the vine. Neither can you bear fruit unless you abide in me. Next slide, continuing the text. I am the vine, you are the branches. So he's already said twice, I am the vine. I am the true vine. I am the vine. You are the branches. If you abide in me and I abide in you, you will bear much fruit. Apart from me, you can do nothing. If you do not abide in me, you are like a branch that is thrown away and withers. Such branches are picked up, thrown into the fire, and burned. If you abide in me, and my words abide in you, ask whatever you wish, and it will be done for you. This is to my Father's glory, that you bear much fruit, showing yourselves to be my disciples. In the two texts, the one for this week and the one for next week, if I remember correctly, that Greek word that's translated remain or abide shows up 14 times. Some talking about us abiding in Jesus, remaining in Jesus, and others talking about him abiding in us. Let's first talk about the first few words of this text. I am the true vine. This is one of Jesus's I am statements. We had one last week. Do you remember what it was? About sheep and flocks and shepherds. I am the good shepherd. In this text, he is the true vine. And you remember last week, I emphasized that he said the good shepherd, with this connotation that there are some not so good shepherds. And for him to say, I am the true vine, makes me wonder, are there some not so true vines? Or vines that, though they may be important and have good meaning, it's not the reality. It's not the true one. It's not the ultimate one. I am the true vine. The Old Testament talks a lot about vines and vineyards. And the New Testament continues this theme that begins in the Old Testament. I am the true vine. It's interesting, this was a part of the Lord's Supper discourse, where Jesus is with his disciples. And not too far away, at the location of this Last Supper in the upper room, is the temple, which just happened to be decorated with vines. And not these vines. See these vines on the table and over on the hospitality table, and I have one here. Woo! A vine. They were gold vines. We'll see here in just a moment a representation of that. At the time of Jesus, a golden grapevine was draped across the four columns at the entrance of the temple. Josephus records that its beauty was such that it was known as a marvel of size and artistry to all who saw with what costliness of material it had been constructed. In a part of the Mishnah, which is a section of the Talmud, it says this: a golden vine stood over the entrance to the sanctuary, trained over posts. And whosoever gave a leaf or a berry or a cluster as a free will offering, he brought it to the priests, and they attached it thereon. Let's go to the next slide. I have a couple of quotes from Flavius Josephus. I love that name, Flavius Josephus. And Flavius Josephus is a Jewish historian with a lot of eyewitness accounts to his history. And I had to read this whole book to come up with those two quotes. No pictures. No, I'm just kidding. I found a reference which told me where to go in my Josephus, the Complete Works. In the section Antiquities of the Jews, which is described how Herod rebuilt the temple and raised its height, misspelled, and made it more magnificent than it was before. If you remember, the original temple had been destroyed and rebuilt, but when Herod came the ruler over Galilee and Judea, he rebuilt and added to, fortified, if you will, beautified the temple. It says this: the temple had doors also at the entrance and lintels over them, of the same height with the temple itself. They were adorned and embroidered with veils, with their flowers of purple and pillars interwoven. And over these, but under the crownwork, was spread a golden vine, with its branches hanging down from a great height, the largeness and fine workmanship of which was a surprising sight to the spectators, to see what vast materials there were and with what great skill the workmanship was done. In another section of Josephus's works, The War of the Jews, under the section A Description of the Temple, but that gate which was at this end of the first part of the house of the temple, as we have already observed, all covered with gold as it was, its whole wall about it. It also had golden vines above it, from which clusters of grape hung as tall as a man's height. I have a visual depiction of what that might have looked like. I wish I had a better one, but there really aren't that many that I could find. But you can see these golden vines going up the pillars. And if you see about a quarter of the way up on the right-hand side, there's a craftsman on a ladder. And he's probably adding to this vine some of the offerings that were given. So when it says people offered a leaf or a berry or a cluster, they were gold. A golden leaf or a golden cluster or a golden grape, which would have cost a lot of money, right, to give that kind of offering. Often those who gave generously to the temple had their names inscribed on the golden leaves. This was a custom that all were familiar with in Jerusalem. So a golden leaf with your name inscribed on it. Kind of like a nameplate on pews nowadays. You know how people donate enough money and they get their name on the end of a pew? That's my pew. Yeah, that's my seat. See, it's got my name on it right there. And sometimes that can become a bit of a, not arrogance, but pride, yes. Pride or self-righteousness. I gave so much money, I got a little placard right there on the pew. No, I'm not intonating that that's what's going on here, but I found it fascinating about this golden vine, something that the people that Jesus was talking to would have known about. When Jesus depicted himself as the true vine, he was most likely contrasting himself with this artificial vine, as beautiful and expensive and ornate as it is. suggesting that if the disciples would offer themselves to him to the degree that people offered their substance to this golden symbol, the result would be abundant spiritual fruit. Jesus is the true vine, not something man-made. So as Jesus uses these words, I am the true vine, there were a number of things in the history, in the mind, in the life, in the culture of the Jewish people that they could hang their hat on that. I am the true vine. So not only was he probably referencing this gold vine going up the temple pillars, he was certainly drawing from the Old Testament imagery of vines and vineyards. Because the vine and the vineyard are old and sacred images in Judaism. The vine represented the covenant people of God, planted and tended by him so that Israel would produce fruit. There are a number of places, and I'll give you a few. I'll list the scriptures, and then I'll just highlight two of them. Psalm 80, verses 8 through 18, for those note takers, Felicia and Stephanie. Isaiah 5, 1 through 7, we'll look at that. Jeremiah 2, 21. Jeremiah 12, 10 through 11. Ezekiel 15, 1 through 5. Ezekiel 17, 1 through 6. And then also 19, 10 through 15. And also Hosea 10, 1 through 2. And there are many other places in the Bible depicting Israel as a vineyard, or a vineyard being a symbol of prosperity and God's blessing. On the other hand, the vineyard, descriptions of it being trampled or destroyed or withered or taken away or not bearing fruit, was imagery of people turning from God, disconnecting from the true vine, disconnecting from God. It says this in Psalm 80, 7 through 9. I don't have this on the screen. I'll read it to you. Restore us, O God Almighty. Make your face shine upon us, that we may be saved. You brought a vine out of Egypt, right? Egypt, the place where they were slaves. And they were freed and given liberty. And they're described as a vine. You drove out the nations and planted it, this vine. You cleared the ground for it, and it took root and filled the land. Israel being depicted as a vine or a vineyard. Isaiah 5, verse 7, it says it implicitly. The vineyard of the Lord Almighty is the nation of Israel. And the people of Judah are the vines he delighted in. Sadly, he looked for justice but saw bloodshed. Looked for righteousness but heard cries of distress. In other words, the nation of Israel wasn't acting like the vine or the vineyard as God intended. Isaiah 3, verse 14. The Lord enters into judgment against the elders and the leaders of the people. It is you who have ruined my vineyard. The plunder from the poor is in your houses. What do you mean by crushing my people and grinding the faces of the poor? Declares the Lord Almighty. So we have these two images of vines. The golden vines on the temple pillars and the Old Testament history and stories and narrative of a vine or a vineyard and the importance of that. And Jesus comes along and says, I am the true vine. The vine that's wrapping itself around the pillars, the shiny gold, the expense, beautiful, worshipful. But I am the true vine. Israel, slated, chosen to be the vineyard of God. Let the vineyard go to disarray. Did not tend it. Did not stay connected to God's laws and his commands and their relationship with him. They followed other gods. They turned their back on the gardener, the vine dresser, as the Father is called in John 15. So Jesus takes his rightful place as the vine, the vineyard, the root, the source. Here in the Gospel of John, it's interesting. John, if you are familiar with the synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they have very similar stories and parables. And John seems to write and have a different purpose in mind. It doesn't have large collections of parables or anything like the Sermon on the Mount, like the other Gospels do. Jesus' longest block of teaching is in the upper room discourse, where this is taking place, where he says these words, I am the true vine, abide in me, and I will abide in you. And at the center of this discourse is this line in John 15. Jesus calls himself the true vine and calls his disciples the branches of the vine. So Jesus characterizes himself as a plant, the root plant, the stalk, the tree. And he says, my Father is the one who's growing this vine, and you are all buds and branches going out to carry the fruit of the vine. There's a little bit of imagery hearkening back to the Garden of Eden and the tree of life. I am the new humanity, he is saying, and you can be too, because I am the true vine, but you must abide in me, remain connected to me. Jesus is the new vine, the new tree of life growing in this new garden. God is growing a new Garden of Eden, because remember the Garden of Eden, before it was messed up, right? It was a place of relationship between God and his creation. Early on, Adam and Eve were making themselves at home in a beautiful way in the garden, and then they made their choice. Jesus says, my Father is the one who's growing the vine, and you are the buds and the branches going out to carry the fruit of the vine. It's like he's saying, I am the tree of life. If you all are following me and trust in me and are connected in me, then you will actually become an offspring of me. The fruit that we don't produce it. I'll talk about that in a minute. But the fruit in our lives is because we're connected to him. It's not something that we can work up on our own. I am the vine, you are the branches. The base metaphor is, I'm the central stalk of the plant. I'm the tree, and you're growing off of me. Therefore, the fruit that is produced in your life is sustained by me, right? He's the source. If we're cut off, if we're disconnected, if we disconnect ourselves from the vine, then it's like we have no life in us. And if we do good things, it won't be sustainable because we're not connected. You see this vine here? the ones I dutifully cut off from the hillside this morning. Don't worry, there are plenty left. If you just take a peek out after church, oh, there is a lot left. I wish they were grapes. We would have the neighborhood vintage Chardonnay or Pinot Noir or something like that. Is this going to live? No. Probably by the end of the day, these leaves are going to start to droop and wilt, and it will die because it's not connected to the source, to the trunk, to the root. And of course, that root is in the soil. And if we disconnect ourselves from the source and we choose not to abide in him, but abide somewhere else, make our home somewhere else, then we will not be able to produce or be the conduits of the fruit that God wants to produce in us. The fruit that we produce is sustained by Jesus, because that fruit will look like him. It will look like him. He even says this stark statement, apart from me, you can do nothing. Apart from me, you can do nothing. Apart from the vine, the root, this branch here is going to wither. It will not be able to do anything. It can't grow anymore. Imagine Jesus coming onto the scene and he's announcing that God's growing a new garden and the plants are new people. And then he talks about himself as being the central plant, right? The vine, the root. Harkening back to another parable, the parable of the sower. You remember the different types of soil that were all around that the sower threw his seeds. It's interesting, in the parable of the sower, people have their chance to sprout out of the soil. But here in John 15, it's like, actually, there's another way to think about this, is that you're not going to sprout out of the soil. We're going to sprout out of Jesus. We're a branch connected to the vine. Jesus is the soil. He's in the true soil. He is the soil. Jesus becomes the tree, the vine out of which every part of the new creation sprouts. The good soil is me, and I am the true vine. Jesus is on the scene announcing the arrival of God's kingdom. And this is the way to be in this kingdom, to be a part of this kingdom relationship between Father, Son, and Spirit, which in so many ways is depicted as a new garden, a new Eden, a new home in him. But if we are not connected, our old humanity lives on. We will not be refreshed and be made new, joining the new humanity in Jesus. If we are not connected, our old humanity lives on. And our old humanity is broken down, barren, and burned up, dilapidated. The video that I showed before my sermon, I don't know if you, it's sad. So Felicia said sad. And I thought, what is the creator of this video, what are they trying to say? And it was a juxtaposition, this is the way I saw it, a juxtaposition of the reality, the words that we read, John 15, verses 1 through 9, I am the vine, stay connected to me, remain in me, I'll remain in you. There will be new life. I am your source. But disconnected from that, from those words, that reality, we saw the background video, which was sad. Did anybody pick up on what kind of scene that was?
Broken down amusement park?
Broken down putt-putt golf course. and yeah, some kind of traveling carnival kind of a thing, like a what did you call it? Amusement park of some sort. And it was sad. It was broken down. It was untended. Wild weeds growing everywhere, broken things all over the place. But if we remain in Him, there will be beauty and growth in life. Diana Butler Bass writes about this passage, and I'll share a few words from her. She says, in recent weeks, I've been planting the garden around the cottage. The cottage is like a little back house where she does her study and her writing and her podcasts and a lot of her work. She calls it the cottage. I've been planting the garden around the cottage. Every year I plant tomatoes, with the typical result of me warring with the neighborhood squirrels. I guess the squirrels like young tomato plants. But about 5 years ago, squirrels weren't the problem. It was a tomato fungus. No matter what I did, no matter how I amended the soil, those poor tomatoes just shriveled up and died. The gardening books I consulted said not to plant tomatoes the next year to give the soil a rest. So the following summer, I skipped the tomatoes. But the summer after the tomato-less summer, I planted them again. They grew to be beautiful, bountiful, and seemed healthy. Then one day, I saw the tiny yellow spots on a single plant, the early symptom of the fungus. I went to the farmer's market and asked the experts how to handle the problem. Mr. Ochoa said that the plants could not live with each other. I had to tear out the infected one to save the others, isolate the fungus, and try to mitigate its presence in the soil. She says it was painful. I felt like a plant murderer. I was in pain as I cut off the vines, tore out the roots, and cast the branches in the garbage. I'm pretty certain I whimpered the whole time. But Mr. Ochoa had been so matter-of-fact. It was just what had to happen in order for all the other plants to bear fruit. Because I didn't grow up on a farm, I focused on the wrong thing. The point wasn't about what was cast away, but what was being saved. The point was about fruitfulness. And so it is with this story. The disciples wouldn't have been surprised about pruning and cutting. They lived in a world of olive trees and grapevines, agrarian society, right? They knew there were specific times to prune and to cut in order to make the orchard more productive or rid a crop of disease. And some people read the text and they focus on the pruning and what or who is going to be cast out. But the pruning isn't the main point. The main point is fruitfulness. And sometimes there are things in our lives that we hold dear to, but it's like a tomato fungus. It hurts us. It's a bad habit. It's a mindset. It's a way of thinking. And those things need to be pruned. As we finish up, I want to read the text from the Message translation, transitioning from the vine imagery to the abide imagery. Let's go to the next slide. I am the real vine, and my Father is the farmer. He cuts off every branch of me that doesn't bear grapes, And every branch that is grape bearing, he prunes back so that it will bear even more. You are already pruned back by the message or the word I have spoken. Live in me. Make your home in me, just as I do in you. Let's think about that for a second. I think all of us want to make our home in God. I can get a hold of that. But him making his home in this ogre, in me, make your home in me just as I do, just as I make my home in you. In the same way that a branch can't bear grapes by itself, but only by being joined to the vine, you can't bear fruit unless you are joined with me. I am the vine, you are the branches. When you are joined with me and I with you, the relation intimate and organic, the harvest is sure to be abundant. Our fruit comes out of our relationship with Father, Son, and Spirit. It doesn't come out of just ourselves. Separated, you can't produce a thing. Anyone who separates from me is dead wood, gathered up and thrown on the bonfire. But if you make yourselves at home, ooh, that's a pretty cool title for a sermon series. Make yourselves at home. But if you make yourselves at home with me, and my words are at home in you, you can be sure that whatever you ask will be listened to and acted upon. This is how my Father shows who he is. When you produce grapes, as a metaphor, we're not producing grapes. We're not walking around with a little vine arms with grapes hanging off. Although that would be a very convenient snack, wouldn't it? When you produce grapes, when you mature as my disciples, that's what he's saying. Using the metaphor of producing grapes. It's about maturity. Abide. Make your home. Remain. The word there translated remain in some translations or abide in others is meno. M-E-N-O. Meno. And it means to remain, stay on, continue, stay with, remain longer, tarry. It can also mean dwelling place, room, abode. It's not just a pit stop when we're on the road sightseeing. It's a place to stay. Other words that use meno as a root word, it means to remain as one, not to become another or different. It's a dwelling place. Abiding is an intimate term, a relational term. We'll talk more about abiding next week. But it's interesting, the imagery that Jesus winds together, vines and abode, vines and abiding. Kind of an odd combination of metaphors. But vines and abodes are images of mutuality and relationship. We can't imagine a branchless vine, and Jesus promises his friends he will remain in them and with them, abide in them and with them. These words connotate relationship and mutuality, a community of friends gathered around a meal. Vines and abodes are images of fruitfulness and abundance. Obviously, vines produce fruit, right? Because it's speaking particularly of a grapevine. But a home, a place or abode, This is the central promise of the Bible, right? This new land that God promised for the nation of Israel. A new home, a new abode. It's a central promise of the Bible. And that suggests abundance as well, right? I will provide you not just a land, but a land flowing with milk and honey and grapes. Oh, what was Joshua and Caleb's report when they went into the land and they saw these big men carrying what? Clusters of grapes as big as they were? What a land of milk and honey and grapes and vines and lions and tigers and bears. Oh my. Well, they probably thought they saw, quote unquote, lions and tigers and bears because they came back and said, there's no way we can enter that land. Those people are huge. It's crazy over there. But it was a land promised to them. God gives God's people a dwelling, a land of milk and honey, where everyone sits under their own vine and fig tree. Diana Butler Bass says this about vines and abodes. She says, vines and abodes are actually images of messiness. You would think it would be easy for me to go up to the hill and just snip some vines. It was an entangled, wild, some of the vines that I was going to pick were actually in the ground and so entangled with other vines that I didn't know where to start. Where do I begin? And then I said, I better chop fast because it's 9:45. So I found some good ones, but it was wild. It's wild out there. In real life, both demand our attention and care. That's why vine dressers train the vines, especially to be able to harvest grapes. You have to guide the vines where you want them to go, what you want them to grow on, whether it's wire fencing or picket fences or trellises. Yes. See, we have vine dressers here in the house. They demand our attention and care. Vines are tangled affairs. Vine growers prune, train, and care for them. They maintain the soil and manage the canopy and attend to their health. The same is true for our abodes, our homes. Dwelling together, making a home, is perfect all the time. Everything goes exactly to plan. No, it could be a messy affair, be it roommates or siblings or marriage or neighbors. Abiding with others isn't easy. You have to work at it. And we must care for the places where we abide as God directed our first ancestors in Genesis to do. And not just our home, but as humans, as God's creation, on God's creation, we are to take care of this global home, this thing we called Earth, this planet. We are to tend and till the earth. I learned a new word reading Diana's article, and I'll teach it to you. It's a French word. As it turns out, vines and abodes have some surprising things in common. The French actually have a word that combines vines and abodes into a single idea. And that word is terroir. Terroir. I don't have a French accent. Does anybody have a French accent? Terroir. It looks like it would be terroir. Yeah, it is. It's terroir. Say it with me. Terroir. Now you have to do terroir. Terroir means that the characteristics of a habitation, geography, climate, geology, right? All this habitation, this environment, where things grow, where in the world it is, the climate, the geology, the makeup of the soil, all of that make their way into the wine, the fruit, the milk, the cheese. Because if a cow is eating a certain grass in a certain place that's really found nowhere else, and they produce milk, and then you make cheese from that, that cheese is going to be distinctive. That cheese is directly affected by the habitat, the geography, the climate, the location, the abode, right? The environment, the habitat, the abode, geography, climate, geology, affects the taste of the grape, and hence the wine or the cheese, the fruit, vegetables and herbs that grow in that particular location. Quite literally, terroir is dirt, right? Terra firma. Well, this isn't terra firma. We have to go outside to be on terra firma. This is terra plank woodness or something. Terroir is dirt. The soil of a place produces a unique fruit. The home of a plant produces a unique fruit which bears the taste of the very ground itself. Vines and abodes, she continues. This is the organic mutuality upon which we depend. Vines and abodes are the story of Genesis, the story of our beginning. And Jesus comes on the scene and says, this is a new start. Y'all didn't handle being the vine very well. I am the true vine. Didn't make a good choice in the Garden of Eden with the tree of life. I am the true tree of life. I am the true vine. This is a new start. This is a new garden. This is a new crop, a new vintage. This is a new Eden, and we are a new humanity in Jesus. But he calls us to make our home in him. Jesus doesn't just want us to do things for him. Stay connected and bear fruit. You better bear fruit, a bumper crop of grapes, you people. That's not it. And he doesn't say, if you don't, I'm going to cut you off. He calls us to stay connected, remain and abide, and he produces the fruits. But we have to be at home in him. The automatic result of staying connected is bearing fruit. We are to stay connected, but it goes even deeper than that. We are to abide in him, make our home in him. Sometimes when we're not doing well, it's been a bad day, or we're having a unusually rough emotional season or spiritual season, sometimes the default is to retreat into ourselves, into our own machinations, into our old tapes and history of what people think about us or used to say about us, or how we retreat. We retreat into that. We retreat, and even if we're trying to distance ourselves from that, we retreat into ourselves, looking for safety, looking for protection, looking for sanctuary. But sometimes we aren't at home in ourselves, are we? Jesus says, abide in me. Make your home in me. We are invited and welcome. We can put our feet up. We can grab something from the fridge. We can make ourselves at home. Are you at home in him? Are you comfortable there? Is it your sanctuary? Is that your source of life? Are you at home in him? The good news is, even if sometimes it's uncomfortable, he is at home in us. He is at home in us, making himself at home in you. May we abide in the true vine, the giver of life and love and liberty. May we remain connected to the source and so bear the fruit of his character and being. We are invited and welcome. May we make ourselves at home in him.